So you wanna be a picture book writer, then you gotta write picture books. And you're gonna need a bucket load of bright ideas for titles, plots, and hooks. If you're partial to prose or you're raring to rhyme, then repeat after me. It's a challenge, but I'm gonna tackle each story 1 month at a time with 12 by 12.
So I am so excited to share my book with you, Shell Song. This book was inspired by shells that my grandfather collected in Japanese American incarceration camps in Hawaii during World War II. And I inherited that shell collection when I was about 10 years old. And so you can see the shells in the first picture and me around that age. In the second picture, the third picture is my grandfather, Shigeki Fujimoto. So I wanted to give you a little bit of the historical context because this is important to understanding this storyline. So many of us probably know about Executive Order 9066 that allowed for the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II on the West Coast. So at that time, Hawaii was not a state yet. It was a territory of the US. And so that executive order did not apply. So instead, martial law was declared in Hawaii, which allowed the FBI to target community leaders and handpick certain people to arrest, including my grandfather. It's important to know that almost 40% of the population in Hawaii was Japanese American. The economy relied on this population demographic, and there was also physically no place to round up the entire community. So unlike on the West Coast, where the entire community was rounded up, in Hawaii, family separation was the particular injustice. So my great-grandfather had founded Fujimoto Trading Company, and it was the largest trading company between Japan and Hawaii at the time. He had gone back to Japan on business. Transportation was shut down after Pearl Harbor, and he couldn't return. And so in his place, they arrested my grandfather. So picture number 4 is my grandfather's U.S. citizenship card for Hawaii. He was born in Hawaii and was a U.S. citizen by birth. Picture number 5 is his arrest papers, in which he was reclassified as an alien enemy. Picture 6 is my father, who was born after his father was taken away from the family. And he actually met his own father for the first time in an incarceration camp when my grandmother took the 3 young children to visit her husband. And so over 125,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated during World War II. Of that number, exactly 0 were ever convicted of being spies for Japan, which was the reason used to incarcerate this population. And there was a bipartisan commission that studied the incarceration of Japanese Americans, and the official report says, and this is a direct quote, that it was not based on military necessity, but rather race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. So that's the historical context for my family story. And I wanted to point out 3 things that you will notice in the artwork for the book. 1, I have some family photos embedded in the artwork. 2, the actual shell collection from my grandfather. Those shells, as well as actual soil from the 2 incarceration camps he was in, are digitally collaged into the artwork. And 3, there's a golden yellow wallpaper in the home, and I just wanted to mention that texture and color was taken from my grandmother's wedding kimono, and I wanted to use that to sort of represent the warmth and what joy that she brought to my grandfather. So with that, I will get into the story. Shell Song. These are the end papers, and the dedication is for my grandfather, Shigeki Fujimoto, whom I only know through stories and seashells, for my family to whom this history belongs, and for all 125,000 plus Japanese Americans incarcerated during World War II and their families. May you always hear a song of peace in your heart. That bright Sunday, like every Sunday, my grandfather put on his favorite record. The children stacked and sorted seashells as the music soared overhead. My grandfather knelt beside them. Look here, this spiral shell. This is the Terebra flammea. And this curled one, Conus abus, the cone shell. And this one with a wide lip, Hydatini Hydatina virili, all homes for sea snails before. The clink clink of the shells, the crackle of the record player, and the quiet hum of my grandfather's voice floated across the room, through the open window, and toward the harbor. But that Sunday, December 7, 1941, in Hawaii, the shriek of warplanes suddenly drowned out the ribbons of song. Over the radio came the news: war, America and Japan, the two countries of their hearts, at war. In war, there was no music, not really. There was never enough milk for their children, or rice, or kindness for anyone who looked Japanese. In war, there was no justice, not for my grandfather, not for any Japanese Americans. Instead, the United States government built prison camps for innocent Japanese Americans. In Hawaii, FBI agents arrested community leaders like my grandfather. My grandfather looked back. "Be strong," he called out. My grandfather was taken with many others: priests, bakers, teachers, husbands, and fathers, to an island prison encircled by barbed wire. The men slept in open tents that flooded in rainstorms at night and baked in the sun by day. When he wasn't forced to work, my grandfather walked the perimeter of the fence. Every now and then, he stooped to pick up a glittering shell. This one with a rough, spiky hull the color of stars, Murex ramosus. Another with a shiny olive-shaped husk etched with lines, Oliva cyana. A delicate petal-shaped shell, Telina scobinata. My grandfather's shell collection grew and grew. He kept the smallest ones in matchboxes and wrote their names on scraps of paper.
There's something so special about being able to hear an author read their own words. And the book has so much poetry and so much emotion anyway. So, but then to hear you telling this story in your literal voice and your writing voice is just incredible.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm very curious how and why you chose to tell this story in first person or
Yes.
perspective. I mean, it's really unique. And I was trying to think of any other book that told the story that way, because this is all happened in the past
Right.
or you were born,
Wow.
and yet you're talking about your grandfather and
Yes.
saying hi, and what was that always the way it was, and what led you to that?
Well, I love that question because I started really thinking about my family story back in college, which was many years ago. I won't date myself, but many, many years ago. And at that time, I had already had the shell collection for years. My grandmother gave me her body of work, which included a handwritten autobiography in Japanese and a collection of poetry, Japanese poems that she had written through her life. And so in college, I translated her work. I created some hand-bound books that are actually in the museum exhibit now. And so that was when I started thinking about it. My grandmother's story ended up being shared in a book that was published in Japan by another author. I translated that book. I tried to get a publisher here. I couldn't. So I've been circling this story for a long time. But at the point where I decided this was going to be my next picture book, it almost came to me whole. I sat down and wrote it from beginning to end. We shifted a few things, but it was basically a whole piece. And the voice came to me whole. And I think part of it was, this is not just my story. It's my family story. I have, a brother, I have cousins, I have aunts and uncles, my dad. This story belongs to everyone. And so it was a matter of choosing, okay, like if I am telling it, like this is the storyline, because I wanted to leave space for other people to be able to share their version of the story as well. And, and also, to leave room for the next generation, because again, like my kids, I have a 16-year-old and an 11-year-old. My cousins have kids, and these stories are quickly disappearing with the generation that lived the experience. And so I feel very strongly that these stories need to be preserved. And so it's not just mine to tell, like the next generation. So actually part of my exhibit, my museum exhibit, is a shelf in which I asked the younger generation after me to contribute something that connected them to the family story. And, I think that's, also why I chose this voice. Like it both, is then authentic to the story that I inherited. And also, if I tell it as the grandchild, I feel like there's some sort of, children understand that connection, with their grandparents. And it makes this story from so long ago, from a generation that's no longer with us mostly, and, from my grandfather who's no longer with us and whom I actually never met in person, it makes his story into a story that can be, I think, understood on some level by children.
Do it together so never you fear. It's a handy little way to help you kick into gear. You're amazing, exciting. Look out, 'cause you're writing 12 by 12.
12 manuscripts.
12 by 12.
12 picture books.
12 by